Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to be looking at ordnance of various types and how it behaves. Now the focus primarily is going to be on anti-armour and armour based ordnance, but I'll take the opportunity to have a little look at all the different kinds of ordnance that you encounter in Upfront. So the first and the most obvious, which I touched on in the previous video introducing armour, is the fairly standard weapons that you find mounted in turreted tanks or self-propelled guns. And the weapon mounted on this T26S here is fairly representative. You also get similar weapons in dedicated infantry guns. And these can either be dual-purpose infantry guns like the 45mm M32 here, or they might be dedicated anti-tank weapons. As you can see, as with the tank-mounted ones, they've got the standard ordnance to hit number range, a effect number when used against unarmored targets, an effect number when used against armored targets. You also have anti-tank rifles. Now there were a few of these sprinkled in just about every army represented in the game except for the US. And anti-tank rifles are a slightly unusual animal because they are an infantry weapon, a very, very useless one in that at every range they generate a single point of firepower if they're used against infantry, or they have an absolutely abominable to hit range and a really poor effect number when used against tanks. Now this is a deliberate design feature because while these things were, well, I suppose moderately effective when they were first introduced towards the end of the previous global conflict, by World War II the anti-tank rifle was very much on its way out, and while many nations persisted in using them up to a certain point, it's very hard to get them to do what you actually want them to do in this game. As you can see, I will be demonstration firing this one just to prove how awkward it is. Lastly, and this is particularly a feature of the German and US armies, you get the bazooka type weapons. So Private Gerhardt here is holding a Panzerschreck. It's quite a formidable weapon, as you can see. So it's got a decent anti-infantry rating and quite a lot of punch when it comes to anti-armor. But it does have its limits. It's a close range weapon. You have to be at relative range 3 or better, or closer I should say. Can't use it beyond that, and it's not a mobile weapon either. Your man has to pick his ground very carefully and occupy it. It's also rather prone to breakdown. It's much less reliable than the US bazooka, which is not very helpful. Oh, and another thing you'll notice is that the to hit numbers, you have these numbers in parenthesis here, which are far, far worse than the regular to hit range. Now, the reason for those is if Private Gerhardt is firing this weapon unassisted, he always uses the worst ratings in parenthesis. However, if he has someone directly assisting him, and this is always denoted by putting a crude counter, someone helping him out with the firing of the weapon, then he is able to use the more advantageous range, and there's slightly less chance of the weapon suffering some kind of malfunction, although as you can see, that's still not a brilliant range compared to most weapons in Upfront. The very last kind of ordnance weapon that you'll encounter in the game, and this is common to all the armies Upfront, is of course the good old mortar. And this is probably the only, aside from the radio card which reflects long-range artillery, this is just about the only indirect fire weapon in Upfront. And it's very much the same principle. You have your to-hit number range. They can be quite temperamental weapons. And as with the Panzerschreck that we just looked at, Mortars are at their best when there is an assistant crewman helping the guy with the mortar. So mortars have the opposite problem to bazooka type weapons in that they're at their best when you're a bit far away. Ideally, relative range 3 works quite well in this case. When you're closer than that, the mortar's effectiveness basically vanishes. The enemy's too close. And instead, the mortar operator has an intrinsic 1 firepower at relative range 4, 2 firepower at relative range 5. Essentially, he's got a pistol or some other small sidearm. So in order to demonstrate these weapons and how they work relative to each other, I've set up this slightly odd, I'll admit, situation where you have we'll call it a stay-behind party of some poor Germans trying to hold off a group of advancing Russians. So the Germans, of course, are at relative range 0 behind a wall. The rather cautious Russian tank is at relative range 2. And somewhat weirdly, I must admit, the very mixed crowd of anti-tank and long-range Russians has dashed ahead to occupy some buildings. This is actually a bad move for reasons I'll explain, but it puts them at relative range 4, which allows some interesting interplay. So starting with the tank, because as I say, this series is mainly about tank and tank-related ordnance. At relative range 2, the T-26 would need to draw a 0 to 2 to land a bead on the German defenders. Now, it has a choice. It can either fire its machine guns or it can try for a shot, but it can't do both. So deciding that he wants to try and blow big holes in the defending Germans, the T-26 commander will play a firing card. Now, unlike regular weapons where you have to work out if you have enough firepower to use a card, ordnance weapons can be triggered by any fire card. So as long as you've got a fire card to play, you can fire your gun. So the Russian will play his card, and at that range he needs to draw a 0 to 2 on a random number check. If the Germans had a concealment card, they could play it at this point and it would increase the difficulty of the shot by the number shown on the concealment card. So if they played a level 2 concealment, the difficulty would suddenly go to the Russians having to draw 1 on a random number check. But let's say the Germans do not have such a card, so they need 0 to 2. They draw their card, and it's a 0, so that's a hit. To calculate the final firepower, terrain does not have any influence on the accuracy of your shot, but it will help provide some cover in terms of the strength of the incoming hit. So the Russians have scored a hit. Now, when firing regular ordnance against unarmored targets, you add the strength of you basically add the random number to the strength of your ordnance weapon. You do not do this if a 0 would not have scored a hit. So if firing at extreme range and somehow scoring a hit by drawing a 1, the Russians would only use an unmodified strength of 2. In this case, unfortunately, they still end up with 2 because they drew a 0. So the strength of the fire attack is 2. The shell lands. Now, that's Group A and that's Group A, so the wall is facing the Russians, which means that the Germans do benefit from its defensive modifier, which means that the ordnance strength of 2 is reduced to a 0. You then, as per a normal fire attack, draw a random number and add it to that. So it's -1 for Gerhardt, which means he's unharmed, and -5 for Bernhoff, which means he's unharmed as well. So what that effectively means is that the shell was on target, but the Germans were thankfully under enough cover that it didn't harm them. One important thing to note, the weapon malfunction number only applies, come on camera, focus, thank you. The weapon malfunction number range only applies when you're seeing if your shot hits. These cards wouldn't cause a malfunction because they're determining the effectiveness of the hit. So it's a two-stage operation. Part A is, did my shell hit? And part B is, if it did hit, did it do any damage? I won't go through the same process for the gun because it's identical to what you've just seen with the tank. But presumably if the Russians had had another shot, it would have been another firing card in hand. It might have been worth them trying that. Now, just to show you how things are with the anti-tank rifle, this is a horrendous weapon to use. As you can see, there's not even a range of numbers. And if you're firing at an armoured target, in contrast to firing at an unarmoured target, instead of adding the value of your random number card, you instead add the range to the target. So let's say Mihailov here was firing at a tank at relative range 5. And let's say by some miracle he drew a 2. He would not add the 2 to his effect of 0, he would add 5. So it illustrates that an anti-tank rifle can be effective if it gets close, very, very close. And indeed any piece of ordnance, the closer it is to the target, the more likely it is to penetrate the armour, hence the difference in the numbers that you add. But it is extremely difficult to score a decisive hit with an anti-tank rifle. Now, with the mortar, I've actually deliberately created an interesting situation for them because most ordnance weapons are not affected by terrain unless it specifically says so. But my reason for sticking Simsalov in buildings is to show that mortars are one of those weapons that can be affected by terrain. So if you're in a building, no outgoing mortar fire. On the coming turn, the Russians would be far better to have Private Petrovsky stop helping Simsalov and just use his rifle while Simsalov draws his pistol, because they are at relative range 4 and they're likely to do far more damage to the defending Germans by attacking them directly rather than indirectly. As for the Germans, I've also put them in an interesting position, because as you can see, and if you remember Gerhard's weapon, is only effective from relative range 3 and closer, whereas the Russian tank has very cleverly placed itself at relative range 2, so it can take the Germans under fire without any danger of coming under fire itself. However, if he wants to, Gerhard can try and take a shot at these fellows, and it might be worth his while doing it. So like any ordnance weapon, Gerhard would play a firing card, any value, and he would take the defenders here under fire. So let's have a look at him. He's got Bernhoff helping him. His targets are at relative range 4, which means he draws a 0 to 2 inclusive to hit. He draws his card and he gets a 2. Good shot, that man. So the 2 is added to his unboxed firepower rating of 3 for a total of 5. It's very impressive. The Russians do get the benefit of the building's defensive terrain, which brings the value back down to a 3. Now, in order to target the entire group, Bernhoff has decided that he's going to attack the unboxed value. And this is why we've got to return to this card here. You'll see there's two values under the morale and the KIA for the infantry gun. That is to account for whether they're being attacked by an area effect high explosive weapon or a anti-armour round. So that's the threshold that has to be reached in an anti-armour attack, and that's the one in a more conventional, call it a high explosive attack. So Bernhoft's final value was 3, and he's going to be targeting the unboxed values because he's going for the area effect to try and get the entire group. So let's start with the gun. 3, this one is 4. He doesn't do it, the gun remains unharmed. Private Mihailov, it's 3 minus 1 for 2, so he is still fine. Corporal Simsalov with the mortar, a total of 7. He is most definitely not fine. He is not killed, but he is pinned. And lastly, Private Petrovsky. Final total was a 3 with that draw of 0. He has a morale of 5, so he's unaffected. So Gerhardt didn't do too badly. He put a shot into the building, sheltering the Russians, probably made a mess, blew a bit of a wall in, but ultimately only Corporal Simsalov is hugging the deck, probably covered in brick dust. But the rest are not really affected by that shot. So that concludes my brief demonstration of ordnance in all its different forms. So you can see, essentially, it's the same core rules that govern the way in which ordnance works. But there are just some very, very slight differences in some of the more specialized units, like the anti-tank rifle, and weapons like the mortar and the bazookas or Panzerschrecks have their own little tweaks that you have to be aware of. But in the main, the good thing about the ordnance rules is that any rule that you need to be aware of when it comes to terrain is already on the cards. The only thing I've not mentioned yet, and this is important to remember, and the reason I chose the wall for the tank is so that I could illustrate this. If this tank is subjected to an ordnance attack, note that armoured fighting vehicles and infantry guns are hull down unless flanked or moving. So if this tank is stationary behind the wall, it counts as hull down. Now what that means is that whereas normally when drawing a random number check to see if you get the right range for your shot to be a hit, if a target is hull down, it has to be a black random number. A red is counted as a miss. Similarly, just as importantly, if your target is moving, it has to be a black random number, otherwise it's a miss. If both of you are moving, if the firer is still able to fire, usually only a tank can fire in these circumstances. If this tank is underway and moving and firing at a German vehicle or group of infantry that's moving, the random number check has to be black and the range is decreased by 1. Anyway, sorry, the to hit range is decreased by 1. So let's say this tank was taking a shot at Gerhard and his friend, but they were on the move somewhere, and this tank was moving, and the shot was being made at relative range 4. It would still have to be a black random number, which it is, but it would also be reduced to, the range to score a hit would be reduced to 0 to 3, because with both parties on the move, it's not an easy shot. So those are the key things to bear in mind with ordnance weapons. It does take a little bit of getting used to, and to be honest, when I am playing any scenario that involves bazookas, anti-tank rifles, mortars, anything that's essentially a big gun or has a tank attached to it. I do keep the rules open next to me, or failing that, I do also have some cheat sheets handy. It is worth having them around because even once you're accustomed to the Ordnance rules, it's very easy to forget the little details. Again, with Ordnance, I would recommend just setting up some small scenarios, maybe even a one-on-one tank duel. That could be quite fun and quite quick to play. And just play it through, get used to how these things work, get used to how movement can govern whether you take a hit on the flank or take a hit on the front armour, because that too is very important. I'm not going to deal with that in this video because I've already gone on quite a bit talking about the procedures for firing and hitting, but I will talk in more detail about damage thresholds and how the impact of ordnance can have an effect. Essentially, it really just boils down to comparing your final attack number with those thresholds. But as I say, that'll be something for the next video when I get round to making it. In the meantime, I hope that this video has been useful. As always, a huge thank you to my regulars who've been following this video series, and if this is the first video on my channel that you've seen, thank you very much for tuning in. I really appreciate your company. I hope we'll see you again. And to all of you, a very big thanks just for sticking with me. And again, I hope this has been of use. Thank you all very much.